Welcome back into the Pig Trail Show. I'm joined as always by Kevin McPherson. I'm Jacob Morris. Kevin, we're now less than 24 hours away from the regular season beginning. Feels like we've already been through a lot with the Purdue game, but Alcorn State on the horizon. Should be an interesting first test for Eric Musselman and the Razorbacks.
I think you're right for several reasons, Jacob. First of all, this Alcorn State program, it's it's in the SWAC. It's back to back. It's a two-time defending SWAC regular season champions, but it's also a team that might present some challenges for this Arkansas team. One of the things that came out of that feel-good Purdue win in a game that didn't count, and the matchup of heavyweights in a packed Bud Walton Arena, was that Arkansas got destroyed on the offensive glass 17-0. 17-0 in second chance points after getting destroyed on the offensive glass 14-1. And this is an Alcorn State team that a year ago was one of the top offensive rebounding teams in the country, top 35-ish. They do a good job on the offensive glass. Arkansas is not a finished product. I don't care what the scoreboard said in an exhibition game in overtime against Purdue, who's got a lot of preseason chatter as not only a number 3 preseason ranking, but some number ones in there coming into the year. Reigning Big Ten champion, returned almost everybody. So you don't take any opponent for granted, not in college basketball. You move on from that. It doesn't count. But what can you learn from it? I think the offensive rebounding, Alcorn State can be the next good test. Because, like I said, this is a team that has held its own on the glass. Now, Alcorn State returns 3 key guys that I see as 3 key returnees, and you kind of see a guard and a wing and a forward in that mix. And they've got some other newcomers, and Musselman thinks this is going to be a good, a 3-point shooting kind of a team. So we'll see what happens there. It's a team that really wants to dictate pace and tempo, slow the game down. Just like Purdue last year, it's a program that held teams in the 60s in scoring. Obviously, Arkansas wants to get into the 80s at home if it can. This is a team that wants to run 80s or better. So you're going to see, you saw a Purdue team, I thought, that dictated tempo in the first half, but Arkansas did a better job as the game wore on. Of course, the overtime helped you get to 81 points. But this is a game where you're looking at offensive rebounding. Now, I've mentioned tempo and pace. I think Arkansas wants to play the turnover game. Alcorn State's been pretty good at that too. A team that turned teams over, last year over 14 turnovers a game it generated, which ranked really high in the NCAA, but also they get a lot of steals. That's something Arkansas has been able to do in the preseason. Can Arkansas continue to do that, not suffer what Musselman likes to call the self-inflicted wounds in the turnover department? I think that's going to be key, even against any opponent. What does Arkansas do really out of the gates in those 3 areas now that we've talked, that I've already gone into? The glass, tempo, and then the turnover game. So I think Arkansas everywhere else, when you look at it on paper, Jacob, everywhere else, Arkansas looks like the team that should dominate. If they can stay competitive or win those other categories, they're probably going to blow the roof off. Look, we're going to get into some more of the fanciful dare to dream stuff for the global look at the season once we get past this matchup, which we're pretty much wrap it up now. But just for this game alone, and this will help us segue, Arkansas's putting out T-shirts in the student section that say 94. 30 years ago, it's been 30 seasons since Bud Walton Arena opened in the 93-94 national championship season. We're 30 years after that. It's 2023, 24. But they're already trying to spark comparison, some of that energy, some of that. Let's do it. Let's see if we can match something like that 30 years later. They're already doing that against the 2-time SWAC defending regular season champs on opening night on November 6th. So I think it's very interesting going from talking about just this one matchup and maybe what does it spark? Because there's been a lot of conversation in the offseason just regarding just how good this Arkansas team might be in year 5 under Eric Musselman.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit exactly on it, right? The record for the Razorbacks is 0-0. Understandably, obviously, excitement out of the roof, rather, for the Razorbacks after that win over Purdue. Alcorn State, like you said, will present challenges. I thought it was interesting. Coach Muss touched on that. He was specific about it even after the Purdue game. But like you said, let's transition to big picture now. Obviously, expectations were high, and now they're sky high after those 2 exhibition games. What can Arkansas fans expect tomorrow and moving forward for the rest of the season?
I'm finishing up an article, sort of this Dare to Dream article that I'm going to publish here in a little bit after we finish the segment. I almost finished it at hogville.net. But we go into some of these dynamics, And what the Purdue game kind of did, because you starting in June, the roster looked great on paper. The additions in the portal look great on paper. Who you're bringing back look great on paper. Then in June, early June, they converge back to campus, everybody, and they start limited summer practices. So you kind of have this buildup of expectations and excitement and energy in the fan base. And then you have an exhibition game against Purdue. And I think it's just like it's a fast track runaway train now. But I think, to tamp it down, before that Purdue game, I've been talking about, when I look at everything, the pieces that Musselman's put together and how he's kind of tinkered and tweaked after a very successful back-to-back Sweet 16 runs with a couple of Elite Eights in there. I think he's looked for ways to move the program forward. And you look at that specifically in recruiting, what did he add? And we've been saying for a while, it's not just a deep team. It's not just quality depth. Positions 1 through 5, if you want to break it down traditionally, 1 through 5. There's depth at every position for once. There's quality in that depth. There's also versatility in the skill sets. I call it diversity of skill. Been using that phraseology for weeks before Purdue ever sniffed Bud Walton Arena and invaded the place. So all that seems real to me as a talking point. Reality is a 31 game schedule. Those are the proving grounds. That's where it's going to play out, and reality will have its way of telling this story. But going into it, this might be Musselman's best team. We were saying this a year ago, and the problem there was Arkansas ran into injury issues. This team has been dealing a little bit with that injury stuff as well, including the return of Trevor Brazile, the centerpiece, Jacob. And he's a guy that's so far. It's been less than a month. Since he came back just a full 5-on-5 participation. That's how it's been for the last year. He blows the doors off the roof on pro day. All the NBA scouts loved him. He had a nice game, as good as anybody. Really, when you look at what happened against Purdue, he numerically he matched what Zach Edey was bringing to the table. They didn't guard each other, not exactly the same kind of frontline guy, but both, the marquee names on their teams, both frontline guys. And so I think so far Brazile's put his best foot forward, given all the circumstances. And you want to start your season understanding you're going to ride with that guy. So I think this is a little bit different than last year when Arkansas lost Brazile early. Nick Smith Jr., the prize recruit, was in and out and missed most of the season. And you had a younger team and only 2 returnees. This is a different dynamic. 5 returnees. We mentioned Brazile. How about Devo Davis, all SEC defensive team? Tremont Mark, a guy who was a stud, probably the player of the game. He was my player of the game against Purdue for multiple reasons. Two-way effect, end of game, ball in his hands, making the big 3 to get to overtime. You've had L. Ellis, who's had just a great offseason, preseason, fall camp. You look at Khalif Battle, who's battled injuries and got back in for both exhibition games and led Arkansas in scoring average in those games and did well defensively. We can go down the list. Chandler Lawson, the transfer from Memphis, who may have made the biggest statement for a starting role, definitely a top 7-8 rotation role, probably alternating with Makai Mitchell at the 5. But you've got all kinds of stuff going on here that helps sell the idea that this could be the team that takes another step in year 5 under Eric Musselman. So let's go back to some symmetry talking points on that. I want to do that a little bit because we go back to 93, 94. Arkansas played Duke in the national title game. That's how Arkansas won its first and only title in basketball, was Duke. Well, you get Duke on the schedule this year. All right, there's a little symmetry there. Guess what? Every time these teams have played, it'll be the 5th time. The series is tied up 2-2. It's huge. They've always been both ranked, but it's always had some major, national title game. In 1990, they met in the Final Four. Duke wins, goes to the championship game, loses to UNLV. A year later, in 1991, Arkansas fans remember the big matchup, 1 versus 2 in Barnhill against UNLV, Larry Johnson, Stacey Augmon, and that group. But Arkansas, in months earlier in New York City, in the NIT in-season Final Four, beat Duke by 10 points. That Duke team, by the way, would go on and win the national title. Arkansas lost in the Elite Eight to Duke 2 seasons ago, and the second Elite Eight under Musselman, to move on to the Final Four. So this game is always, so even though you're playing it in November, it's got huge implications. It matters. It's the first ever ACC SEC challenge, national TV audience on ESPN. So this is a big deal. And when these teams meet, either foretelling of history or it directly impacts the riches of the of postseason. And so there's some maybe some symmetry there. How about the fact that the last time Arkansas won a national title, the only time 30 years ago, they played their red white game at Barnhill because Bud Walton hadn't quite opened up yet. Well, we know they play the red white game every year in Barnhill, but they played their red white in Barnhill, and now they'll open their season up at BWA. And in both scenarios, there was a little bit of trial run gamesmanship at BWA. When they opened the season in 93, opened the arena in 93, 94, the dedication game, the national unveiling of this 20,000 seat arena on ESPN was against Missouri on December 2nd. But technically, the first game was against Murray State a few days before that. Very little fanfare. It's when the doors open. It was a trial run. Let's break it in with what should be a win and then have this big matchup. There is a little similarity. It may be a stretch here, but this year you had a trial run against a top 5 ranked team against Purdue in a game that didn't count, and measure yourself because a few weeks later you're going to do another top 5er in Duke at Bud Walton Arena. So maybe there's a stretch there. I'm writing about this as well, this comparison. But when you're laying out 94 T-shirts for the game, the home opener against Alcorn State, you're pushing every button you can to find parallels because you want to somehow track into a title game again 30 years later and maybe win one. Arkansas obviously also went to a title game in 95, 96 where it lost to UCLA, but it's been decades, Jacob. And Arkansas's, here's a little bit more. That 93, 94 title team, the 4 years prior to that, Nolan Richardson had a Final Four in 90. I mentioned that, lost to Duke, an Elite Eight the following year, lost to Bama, got knocked out, upset in the second round a year after that. But then with the core of the 90, some of the key players, including Corliss Williamson, Scotty Thurman in 92, 93 as freshmen, that team went to a Sweet 16. So these big seasons were not in a vacuum. There was a buildup. There was program momentum. You look at the last 4 years under Muss, 21 season in his opening year. Yeah, that team probably had to win the SEC tournament, but it got short due to COVID. But then back to back to back Sweet 16s, a couple of Elite Eights. So you see a 4-year buildup of program momentum and success and recruiting as a result. And each coach along that path added enough wrinkles and tweaks to finally get over the hump. Well, Richardson did. He added size to that front line, and it seemed to be what Arkansas needed. Musman's gotten bigger and more athletic on the front line, but he's also addressed three-point shooting and some other problem areas with this last class. It's why I think Arkansas, when I look at it on paper, Jacob, has the makings for the Final Four kind of roster. Again, injuries, some luck during the season, matchups, where you're sent in the NCAA tournament, what seed do you get? I mean, all kinds of things are going to shape this. But just looking at it, we're talking about it, we get to dream a little bit more. The season doesn't tip off for another day. So we get to talk about things that haven't happened yet, as though we can see a path for Arkansas maybe to get back to a Final Four and maybe play for a national title.
That excitement machine you're talking about, the 94 shirts on the chairs before the Alcorn State game, you're just adding to it right now. If you had a message for the fans here, everybody's dreaming big, everybody wants good things for this team. What would it be? What would the message be to the fans?
Well, obviously it's sit back and watch what happens. They're not going to win every game. That's not, and with every loss, a fan base seems to think the sky's falling. And especially when you pair 2 or 3 losses together, which has happened for Arkansas in their most successful seasons these last few years, usually around the start of SEC play. I think this team's built a little different and might actually start SEC play a little better. When I look at the league, we talked about non-conference and Duke. We talk about before that, you go to the Bahamas and you play Stanford, then Memphis or Michigan. Then you're going to get one of these 4, North Carolina, Villanova, both ranked in the top 25, by the way, preseason, Texas Tech or Northern Iowa. You've also got a good Furman mid-major coming in after you play Duke, a team that knocked off 4-seed Virginia in the last dance. Then you're back in Tulsa against OU. So you've got a 6-game stretch there. But in league play, you open with Auburn at home. You go on the road after that for 2, and Auburn's projected as an NCAA tournament value kind of team. They've got some preseason rankings. Then you're on a road against a much improved Georgia program, on the road against Florida, who a lot of folks think will be an NCAA tournament team. Then you come home for A&M, predicted as the preseason one of 2 teams, whether you think it's Tennessee or A&M, those are the two popular picks to win the league. So you got those four to open, and Arkansas has traditionally had poor starts. So you wonder, how do they navigate those first four? And then as you move along, I think there's as many as 8 teams in this league that could win it, or at least not win it, but play well enough in the league to make the NCAA tournament. It's deep. And so having said that, I think throughout the 18-game schedule, there are no nights off, but I see a couple of more multi-game stretches. 3 games starting February 14th. You host top 10, number 9 preseason Tennessee, followed by 2 road games, Mississippi State and that Texas A&M squad I mentioned. And then you finish up with a 3-game set on the road at Kentucky, also preseason top 15, 16, home against LSU, and then on the road against Bama, also preseason top 25, I think number 24. So you've got several pockets of multiple games and clusters of games, I think, that might stand out looking at it from this vantage point. Sometimes things play out a little differently than we think, but right now that's where. So I think non-conference and conference is the toughest they've had under Musselman as far as what it looks like going into it. But I also think the team's built to deal with it better than anything he's had. And we know starting in mid-January, his teams start snowballing in the right way. They get everything figured out defensively. Everything else falls in around that. We talked about the 3 keys that mattered most, even against Alcorn State. For this team, it's always about defense, though. We didn't say that. And that'll be the case for every game. Let's see what they do defensively. Force 20 turnovers against each exhibition opponent, going from D2 Texas Tyler to number 3 Purdue. Let's see if Arkansas can continue. And they look, the Razorbacks challenge just about every shot the Boilermakers put up. I don't know that I've seen a defensive performance like that, even under Eric Musselman, consistently for 40 minutes. Let's see what happens as the thing moves along. But this team to me is dangerous, and everybody should be worried about Arkansas. I think it's a team that deserved maybe a little more respect in this preseason talk for potential to win the SEC. Musselman said that doesn't matter as much as preparing for March. I actually agree with him, but I'm not so sure he can't do both this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And wrapping up here, if we're talking dare to dream, right? We've hit the defensive identity of this team. It's always strong, but this year it's been really impressive again through just 2 exhibition games. We've talked depth. If you're looking into your crystal ball, if there's one thing that's going to get Arkansas over that hump, get them to the Final Four or maybe beyond, what would that be for this team?
I think it's exactly the big idea of all of this depth to weather, quality depth and versatility to weather whatever's thrown at Arkansas, whether it's injuries, which have slowed Arkansas down for parts of seasons, most of last season, but even before that, the prior 2 years that were back-to-back Elite Eights, they had in-season injury stuff that played out. I think they've got the guns to weather that. I think when you get into March, it's about matchups. The best thing you can do to not only be playing well together is have answers for things that might be different team to team. And Arkansas would always kind of hit a wall, whether it was Baylor or UConn or Duke. And those were pretty significant walls. You had 2 eventual national champions in there. It seemed like juggernauts. We know Duke's no slouch, lost in the national semifinals 2 years ago. But I think Arkansas this time around may be better equipped everywhere to deal with whatever comes at them. I think that, to me, says everything. And one thing, Eric Musselman, it's not a cockiness, but there is a confidence in his voice when he talks about the collective experience, the versatility in this group. And there is, I've been around this guy enough. When you look, looking at post-game interviews, preview interviews, press conferences, Zooms, just how he goes about it. Sometimes you learn from things he doesn't say. Sometimes you learn from things he does say. But there is a confidence that has been prevailing for months when he speaks to the public and when he addresses media about this group collectively, when you talk about experience and how he can mold that and how they've been further along in installing things they want to do. I think there's nothing hidden or veiled in that message. I think it's clear. This group is probably got him on a path to have a chance to have his best results yet as a college coach. Remember, in 4 years in Nevada, he took what's, not a high major, not a basketball school, to its own Sweet 16 and winning league titles and, making NCAA tournaments before getting to Arkansas. So he's ramped everything up all along the way in just 8 years. This could be, boy, I'm going to get I'm going to get a lot of criticism if things don't play out because I can't predict injuries and some other factors. But I've been following it for a long time, including those teams in the '90s. I was there. I was actually in the media covering those, at the peak of the program. This to me feels like that. And when I look at the roster and just trying to be logical about it, I can see some similarities in how things could play out. Not predicting they will, but how they could play out. So we'll see what happens.
See, that hype machine is already rolling. You're just adding to it right now, is what you're doing.
Right. I'm dousing it with.
You're throwing oil on the fire, gasoline on the fire, whatever it might
Well,
be.
yeah, I probably went a little far today, but you know what? I believe it. I actually,
Yeah.
this is not. I mean, I've really tried to drill down on a lot of stuff, and I think there's some. I think Arkansas has probably got some lateral movement issues at times defensively, but that was the case 3 years ago, and I think Musselman's best team was 3 years ago, that first Elite Eight team. I think this one could be better. So I think there's obviously things. I still wonder how good they're going to be as a rebounding team after what happened against Purdue. I still wonder about certain things. It's not going to be a perfect team. I don't expect them to win every game, but I look at everything in front of this team and how it's going to prepare them, and how they'll learn from these games. They don't play. There's no soft non-con like there might have been 2 or 3 years ago. The league is as tough as it's been. This team's going to get tested more than ever. And I think they're built to weather it, to maybe thrive in it. And then when postseason comes, I think there's the pieces are there to take it further than they've done in 30 years.
Well, there you go. Anything else you want to add, Kevin, before we go?
Not really. Well, just only this. It starts tomorrow, and we're not going to be talking about national championships based on the results of that game. We certainly won't if Arkansas finds a way to lose. But even if you win by 30 or 40, we got to keep paying attention to what this team does moving forward.
Hey, I think that's the message. No national championships are won or lost against Alcorn State tomorrow. Kevin, thanks so much, as always, for joining us. Make sure to stay tuned for more Pig Trail Show right after the break.